So, as the world watches the twists and turns of the war with Iran, the global markets are mirroring that chaos. The price of oil plummeted and the stock market soared on Monday after Trump's announcement of positive talks with Iran. But Iran's denial of any communication caused the price of oil to creep up again. Fears are mounting that this economic volatility could create major long-term damage. Well, former top economic advisor under President Obama, Jason Furman, argues it might not be all that bad. He tells Walter Isaacson that while the war could spark short-term pains, the future impact will be much less dramatic. And he explains how the U.S. economy has fared so far under President Trump.
Thank you, Paula. And Jason Furman, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back with you.
So you've got a op-ed piece in the New York Times that says, if you hate Trump's economy, I have news for you. What's the news for us?
The news is that the economy over the last year was an awful lot like the economy in 2024. Now, if you're Donald Trump, that's disappointing because you think you took something that was a horrific wreck and turned it around. But if you're a Democrat and thought maybe Donald Trump was going to take something perfectly good and wreck it, maybe that's a little bit disappointing to you as well.
Well, that's kind of odd. We had these tariffs. Everybody said tariffs are going to cause massive inflation. Tariffs go up, go down, whatever. That didn't really cause much of an issue?
Look, I would separate two separate things. One is how did the economy do in 2025 and in the last couple of months? That's a function of lots and lots of things. What our technology is like, what our people is like, the decisions of our businesses, and then to some degree, but probably not the biggest factor, policy the president has. And when you take all of that together, the year as a whole wasn't super different from the year before. Now, I do think 2025 would have been even better, but for all of those tariffs. So I think Donald Trump hurt things, just maybe not as much and as dramatically relative to all the other huge forces that affect the economy.
So what are those huge forces?
The biggest one in the last year has been the AI boom. A lot of it's showing up on the demand side of the economy as we're building more data centers and making investments to make AI work. I think we've seen some tentative data showing that maybe it's actually starting to show up in productivity, enabling people to do more with each hour of work.
In other words, we're increasing productivity because of it, right?
I'd been skeptical that it was showing up in productivity because businesses are slow to adapt and figure out how to use it. In fact, in the short run, I sometimes find myself spending hours trying to figure out the latest and best ways to use the technology, in some sense, not getting anything done in those hours other than an investment, hopefully, in my future productivity. We've seen that in a lot of businesses, but the latest data suggests businesses really are starting to figure it out, and it is starting to show up in the economy as a positive.
What's happening with young workers and Generation Z, they seem to be the ones that are getting hit, and they're the ones very, very upset about the economy. I think the New York Times, which you work with, they asked about the labor market to a focus group of Gen Z people, and they said it was a scam, unfair, horrible. What are some of the economic changes that are affecting people who are like in the early 20s?
Yeah, so we have seen a slowdown of hiring of young people. AI is not the biggest factor in that. Some companies blame it on AI, but it isn't really AI. They just have some other reason why they want to cut back on hiring. Some of it has been that the Fed, in an effort to slow the economy, kept interest rates high for a long time. That was the right call, given how high inflation was, but it has a downside, and that downside shows up in the labor market, and it shows up in the labor market often first for younger workers. One reason why I don't think it's AI is if you look at the pattern of that job loss, it's not just college-educated workers. You see it across the educational spectrum. In fact, a higher level of education historically has been and still is some of the best insurance you can have against job loss.
We've had the highest tariffs now, I think, since the 1940s. Is that right?
Yeah, since the 1940s.
So why hasn't that ticked up inflation?
It has added to inflation. The inflation rate would probably be at the Fed's target of 2.0%, but for the tariffs. Because of the tariffs, they're adding about half a point, maybe a little bit more to inflation. So when I say inflation has been roughly unchanged over the last couple of years, In some sense, it would have fallen, but the tariffs prevented it from falling. And that's one of the things that has complicated the Fed's job. It's one of the reasons that it hasn't cut interest rates as much as people might have liked for it to have cut rates.
What do you think the Fed should be doing now?
They're going to be very nervous about the inflation readings over the next couple of months. They're really going to spike as gasoline prices rise as a result of the Iran conflict. I think they should look through that and ignore it. There's nothing the Fed can do to settle the affairs in the Middle East. That is not an economic problem. That is a national security problem. They should focus on the underlying inflation rate and probably be willing to consider cutting rates if it looks like the economy needs it, if it looks like the labor market is weakening.
Well, let's talk more about those effects of the Iran war. It's sort of a lot of volatility these days, but in some places you can see the price of gasoline at the pump pushing closer to $5 for premium and certainly for diesel. Doesn't that filter throughout the entire economy and cause inflation?
Oh, absolutely. We're going to see extra inflation. We're going to see difficulties for consumers. The impact on the economy as a whole is more muted because we also are net oil exporters, which we weren't, for example, in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution sent oil prices spiking. Our industries don't use nearly as much oil as they used decades ago. So for aggregate GDP, it's going to be a small hit. But for consumers, it's going to be a much larger hit.
Your president, you worked for President Barack Obama, once said that the strongest correlation to his popularity ratings was the correlation between them and the gas price at the pump. To what extent are we going to see some political fallout here?
I think we probably will. Look, when gas prices went up, we would go into panic mode in the White House. We would be looking at every single economic indicator to predict what was going to happen, be thinking about every single policy tool to understand what we could do. You see this administration doing that with basically allowing Russia to export its oil, allowing Iran to export its oil, coordinating a global release. All of that, though, is really small compared to the more than 10 million barrels per day, about 1/10 of global oil production, that's now offline because of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. As long as that's closed, everything else is just dancing around the edges to mitigate just a small fraction of the damage that that's doing.
Well, one of the things I learned in economics was that the economy and especially the markets kind of like certainty. And boy, one of the things that's happened in the past year has been amazing volatility. Tariffs go way up, they go down, they go back, they go forth. Likewise, oil prices, maybe they'll stabilize for, West Texas Intermediate, it'll be around 80 a barrel, but it'll have gone up to 100, down to 60. How does that volatility affect the economy?
Look, there's two separate things here. How does it affect the stock market? Quite a lot. We saw a lot of drama in April of last year around Liberation Day. We've seen a lot of drama in the last couple of weeks around Iran. How does it affect the economy? Somewhat, but not quite as much as the dramas in the financial market headlines, because it turns out there's just an awful lot that matters in the economy. Some people are making decisions based on this, but an awful lot of businesses are making decisions entirely unrelated to these oil price gyrations.
You say that the president can't do much to change the economy. It's been pretty much the same, whether it was Joe Biden or Donald Trump. But do the thought experiment for me. If Donald Trump had not imposed tariffs off and on and high tariffs and not done this war with Iran, how would the economy be better? And if so, how much so?
Yeah, I think it would be better. The tariffs have probably added 0.5 point to the inflation rate. The war is going to add at least another 0.5 point, probably more than a percentage point. So inflation would be lower if Donald Trump hadn't done these two things. Economic growth would be higher. I'm not quite sure how much higher. That's probably more like a few tenths than, a percentage point or two. But you want to separate, two things in your mind. One is presidents do matter, and every tenth matters, and we should fight for every extra tenth on growth and for every extra tenth reduction in inflation. But they don't matter quite as much and dramatically as the way we sometimes talk about them. And both of those statements are true.
One statistic that always seems important to me is the overall purchasing power of wages. Explain what that is and how that's been affected recently.
Yeah. So economists like to look at, on average, how fast did wages grow and compare that to how fast did prices grow. Over the last year, wages grew 1.4 percentage points faster than prices grew. And that represents, good news for workers. It's actually towards the upper end of what we've seen over the last decade. But, it's still a little bit disappointing in the grand scheme of what we've seen over time. I think we would have done even better had it not been for the tariffs, but it's about, the same pace we had seen in the year before. Of course, that's an average. For some consumers, it was a lot worse, but for some, it was even better.
Wages have been stagnating for years. Why are they starting to go up now?
You know, they've been the last couple of years, actually. It started around 2015. So we have now a decade where real wages have been rising faster. And some of that's productivity is faster. When you get more productive, you tend to have higher wages. Some of it is the increase in inequality among wage earners has stabilized. You still have a growth of inequality between wealth and work, but within workers, you're not seeing the same increase in inequality you were seeing before.
What effect has there been on the crackdown on immigration, legal and illegal?
That has dramatically slowed the pace of job growth. We basically haven't had any job growth over the last year. Previous years, we'd had, 100,000 jobs a month or more. But it also means we don't need as many jobs to keep the unemployment rate constant. And so even though job growth has slowed, unemployment only increased a little bit over the last year. And that's because when you have more immigrants, legal or illegal, you need more job growth. So we don't need quite as much job growth as we used to need.
Is that what Chairman Jerome Powell meant when he said it looks like that's about what the economy needs in terms of dealing with very, very low growth in the labor force? When he said it doesn't really matter that we've had zero job growth?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the question for any country, whether you're looking at Germany or Luxembourg or China, is how many jobs do you need? In Luxembourg, you don't need that many jobs. It's small. In China, you need an awful lot of jobs. To answer that question, it's not just the size of the country, but the demography. We have a lot of people who are reaching retirement age now. We have fewer people reaching working age now. And so you take all of that into account, and absent immigration, our labor force is roughly flat. We have as many people retiring as entering the workforce. We actually don't need jobs in order to keep unemployment constant. Now, I would rather we had more immigration and more job growth and more economic growth. But in terms of jobs for everyone who needs one, right now, a number of 25 or 50,000 a month is plenty.
We have what's called now, I think, a K-shaped economy, where the spending by wealthy Americans is driving a greater share of the growth, while working class and poor Americans less so. What are the ramifications of that?
Well, I'm not actually sure that we're seeing that in the data on consumption. Unfortunately, the government doesn't report data on consumption by income groups, so different economists have cut it differently. And the best measures I've seen actually show moderate income families consuming at, as much of a rate as high income, maybe even a faster rate. Now, just to be clear, there is a lot of inequality. There's growing wealth inequality, given how much the stock market has risen. But wage inequality, if anything, has narrowed over the last decade. So the inequality trends are a little bit complicated. Some measures of it go up, some measures of it go down. The starkest is the stock market, but the best news is coming out of the labor market, where you've started to see some real gains across the board.
You say the economy hasn't changed that much, but there's one issue that really over the past 10, 15, 20 years keeps getting worse, which is affordability. And that especially comes down to housing affordability. And for people, as we say, in the younger people in their 20s, things just aren't affordable. What's been causing the affordability crisis?
Yeah, so anything you want to contextualize over 10 or 15 years, I'm going to completely agree with you. What I didn't what I don't like is saying like, oh, all of a sudden affordability is a problem and it was fine before. Housing is, we just don't let people build as much as they'd like to build in the places that are most desirable. I think supply is the biggest part of it. Interest rates and high mortgage rates are another part of it. And that's related to having a large budget deficit. When the government's borrowing a lot, it's competing for capital. It drives up interest rates. That means, ordinary Americans need to pay more for their mortgages. Healthcare has been another chronic affordability issue. And, the issues get very, very complicated in delivery system reform. There's not a single magic bullet that will solve that, but there's lots and lots of things that, we should be doing.
If you talk about long-term issues, the biggest one seems to be the hollowing out of an American middle class and an American working class. Is that true, and how can that be reversed?
Look, some of the hollowing out is people who are middle class becoming affluent. We just have more and more of our population is affluent than ever before, and that's a really wonderful thing. We have seen faster wage growth for households at the 10th, 20th, and 30th percentile than we have at the 80th or 90th percentile. That's been going on for about a decade now. That's another piece of good news. But we need to both prepare people better for jobs. I think education will continue to matter. I'm worried about what AI will do to jobs. I'm more worried for people that don't have a college degree than people who do, notwithstanding all of the conversation about what it does for white collar jobs. And the other thing we need is to run an economy that's as strong as possible. So more balanced economic growth, less reliance on one sector of the economy, more spreading it across the board.
Well, let me push back a little on what seems to be your optimistic scenario, which is that really in the past 30, 40 years, that ability to get a good job at a good wage, like at a manufacturing plant or a factory, know that job would be secure, be able to buy a home by age 30, that seems really to have been gutted. Am I wrong about that?
I look at what fraction of the population age 25 to 54 is working, for example, because you sort of exclude some people in retirement age, some people school age. That is basically near the highest it's been in 25 years. Look at how wages compare to prices. They've grown faster for about a decade now. I look at things like the size of the houses that people have today, the number of square feet, the amount of appliances, all of that more than it was in the past. So I think we do have a little bit too much of a bad news bias, and we need to simultaneously keep in our minds things could be even better. We've made unforced errors. We've not done some of the things that could help, while also remembering, life 25 years ago wasn't quite as idyllic as we sometimes remember it as having been.
Jason Furman, thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.